Hello and welcome to the ClassACT Zoom Forum, Voter Suppression and the Impact of COVID-19 on Voting Rights. I'm Marion Dry, co-chair with Jonathan Sprague of ClassACT HR 73. ClassACT, Class Achieving Change Together, is a nonprofit organization of members of the Harvard-Radcliffe class of 1973, founded to bring classmates together to address important local, national, and international problems by creating and supporting positive change. Tonight's forum is one in a series of forums addressing the challenges and impact of COVID-19 on society. The ClassACT board has identified the lack of voter and civics education as a key issue facing our democracy. As part of our ongoing focus on this issue and in support of Justice Aid, a ClassACT strategic partner and sustained collaboration, we are pleased to present this forum. With pleasure and with gratitude, I now welcome this evening's moderator, Therese Steiner, co-chair with Bahman Mosara Rahmani of the ClassACT Voter and Civic Engagement Initiative, and board member of both ClassACT and Justice Aid.
Thank you, Marion. The fundamental right to vote is guaranteed for all Americans in the US Constitution and subsequent amendments. In 1870, the 15th Amendment guaranteed the right to vote for all male citizens, regardless of race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. 50 years later, in 1920, the 19th Amendment guaranteed the right to vote for women. In 1965, the historic Voting Rights Act prohibited racial discrimination in voting. And in 1971, when many of us were in college, the 29th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18. Yet we have a history of voter suppression in this country, particularly in communities of color, and longstanding issues of civil rights and human rights that have been put into staccato relief by the advent of COVID-19. To help us frame these issues, we've put together a terrific lineup of panelists. We're going to start with Kevin Benish. Kevin Benish is an adjunct professor of law at NYU Law School, and in August starts a clerkship with the Second Circuit Court of Appeals and the Honorable Susan Carney, an HR 73 classmate. Kevin?
Thanks so much for having me. And I just want to say thank you to all of the panelists. I really feel enriched by this experience. And I think that voting rights have long been important, not just to me, but to this country and to all of us, but especially now, given the times in which we're living. So my background is in Wisconsin politics. Before studying law and becoming a lawyer, I actually worked in the Wisconsin legislature, so I take a long view of this. But I think that the times in which we're facing right now show really how urgent things have become, and how Wisconsin, which has long been a laboratory for democracy, is now showing the bad results that can come from that laboratory. And those are particularly important for the November election. So for those of you who may have been following the news over the past month, you'll know that in Wisconsin, there was the presidential primary, as well as an election, the spring election, for a seat on the state Supreme Court. Wisconsin Supreme Court has 7 members. They're all elected positions. The court is currently held by conservatives. So this seat, and if there's to be any hope of flipping the seat toward more progressive causes, it's really important for that seat to have been switched. So everyone knew this, and as a result, there was a lot of pressure from interest groups in the election, and unfortunately, the coronavirus actually presented a chance for those hoping to maintain the seat within the conservative slot to take advantage of the situation. And so what happened was, despite at least 16 other states postponing their presidential primaries and spring elections, the conservatives in Wisconsin decided to force the election to move forward. They did so by refusing to collaborate with the democratically elected governor, to push back the election to a different date. And they also sued when the governor tried to unilaterally change the timing of the election. Again, if you've been following this in the news, you'll know that both the United States Supreme Court and the Wisconsin Supreme Court, which is currently in conservative hands, both then handed victories to the Republican Party, which was supporting the conservative candidate. And the view among the conservatives, it was no secret, was that they believed that forcing the election to take place during a global pandemic would benefit them. We know now that we have the results that that wasn't the case, but we know also that their tactics very well could have worked, and that their tactics, if implemented again in November, could sway the election and certainly will have an impact when it comes to disenfranchisement and voter suppression. And again, Wisconsin really provides a frightening prelude to what might happen in November. On Election Day, on April 7th, for instance, in Milwaukee, which is the source of it is the community in which the overwhelming majority of people of color and diverse populations in Wisconsin live. For instance, 70% of Wisconsin's African-American community lives in Milwaukee. That city went from 180 polling locations down to five polling locations for the entire city of Milwaukee, which is by far the largest city in the state. We saw polling locations, even those that were open, required people to stand in line for hours. There were polling locations that stretched for blocks and blocks, and all the while people were not necessarily having access to PPE. They didn't have access to things like hand sanitizer, and they didn't know if they'd eventually be able to vote. Again, we now know the outcome of the election. The Democratic Party's candidate actually did prevail, but we also saw thousands of people not get to vote. People who requested absentee ballots never received them. And this included even elected officials who actually documented this. We saw city clerks and municipal elected officials who were well-intentioned in trying to implement the election under the best circumstances not be able to do so because despite their best efforts, they just were not prepared for the sudden surge in demand for vote by mail. Now, all of these outcomes show the risks that we have for November if we don't have better planning in place for our elections.
Myrna Pérez is director of the Voting Rights and Elections Program and deputy director of the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. Myrna?
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being able to speak to interested and engaged folks. One of the things that is very plain is that the coronavirus crisis has very much disrupted all aspects of American life, and our elections are no different. We've seen elections and primaries needing to be moved. We're in the middle of raging debates in the halls of Congress and in state houses across the country over what changes need to be made in order to make sure that our elections are going to be safe and healthy for people to participate in. And the Brennan Center has studied and looked at this by talking to a number of election administrators and advocates and doing our own research. And we believe that most of the changes that are needed can be broken up into what I'm calling 5 different buckets of advocacy. The first one is voter registration. Now, what do I mean by that? Right before an election, we would be seeing people outside on sidewalks in front of stores, at festivals, trying to register people to vote. We also know that most Americans are registered when they go and get a driver's license. And because driver's license offices are shuttered and physical distancing requirements and shelter-at-home instructions are requiring people to not be gathering into large groups, we have all of these eligible Americans who are not registered to vote who won't be registered to vote unless we figure out how are we going to register them in a time of social distancing when we don't have open public agencies. So that is some advocacy that needs to happen at both the state and the federal level, and also gives opportunities for Americans like the folks watching to be able to lend a hand and help their neighbors who may be on the wrong side of the digital divide or may have language or other limitations that may make it hard for them to understand that you either need to register to vote or how to register to vote. Another bucket is expanding vote by mail access. Certainly, there are going to be people for whom going to a polling place in person is not going to make sense because they're either high risk or of limited mobility. The lines that may be there may be specifically threatening or dangerous for people. And as such, we need to make sure that every eligible American is able to cast a vote by home if they need to be. And it'll be really important to lean on the existing state mechanisms that allow for people to vote absentee, but to make sure that these mechanisms have been modified so that people can take advantage of them and be able to vote by home if their health or safety requires it. But another bucket is we need to make sure that we maintain adequate polling places. The reality is that every eligible American should be able to cast a vote at home if they want to, but there are going to be communities all across the country that just cannot rely on the mail because they currently get really poor mail service. For example, if you live on a Native American reservation, it's really likely that the way your tribe understands your address looks different than the way your post office understands your address to be. Or if you live in a really big high rise in the middle of a dense urban area, or you live in a really rural area, you may get bad mail. And as such, we cannot be forcing people to rely on a system that has already failed them when it comes to casting their fundamental right to vote. Also, as states are getting used to an increased amount of people voting by mail, there's going to be some slippage. Every time you change election systems, something glitches, something goes wrong, and polling places are important, what we would call fail-safes, so that if something happens, mail ballot on time, or you didn't mail it early enough in advance, you do have the option of being able to vote in person. And of course, we cannot forget those members of our community that have visual or physical impediments that require certain technology that right now best exist at polling places so that they can cast an independent and autonomous ballot. Related to the idea of in-person polling places, we also need expanded early voting options, because if people are going to be voting in person, we don't want them all crowded on the same day. We want to be able to smooth out when people go in to vote and be able to diversify the kind of pressure that is being put on the polling locations. The easiest and best way to do this is by having lots of different days for long periods of time that people can vote. That way you can make sure that everybody's not cramming through the same doorway or trying to access the same voting machine. That way you're also giving poll workers a chance to wipe down voting machines in between voters, and that people can take the time that they need in order to be able to be 6 or so feet away from the other person. Expanded early voting opportunities are a really important part to keeping people safe. And finally, the last bucket of advocacy is we need massive, massive, massive voter education. So much is changing and so much has changed. And voters are going to have a very hard time keeping up with the new voting date, what the new voting rules are, where their new polling place is, what day they need to apply for an absentee ballot, when they have to mail it by, what do they have to do to get it to count. All of these kinds of changes are going to be very overwhelming to voters who are already facing all sorts of other changes because of the disruption in their life. And the public education needs to be really robust and really good if people are going to have the information they need in order to be able to participate in an informed way. This is especially true with low information voters who may not have access to the social media or online guides that some people get some of their information for. We need to make sure that we have public education campaigns that speak to all Americans and make sure that all of us can be participating.
Julie Houk is the Managing Counsel for the Voting Rights Project and Election Protection of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Julie?
Thank you, Therese. The Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law was founded in 1963 at the request of President John F. Kennedy to enlist the support of the private bar in advocating for and litigating cases involving civil rights matters, particularly at that time in the sphere of voting rights. Since that time, the Lawyers Committee has continued to advance voting rights as well as civil rights in other areas, including criminal justice, economic justice, community development, fair housing, and public policy, and other areas. Lawyers Committee helped found the Election Protection Coalition in 2001 following the 2000 election. Currently, it has a nationwide coalition involving over 100 groups, both nationally and in the states. It's the largest nonpartisan voter advocacy and voter protection coalition in the country. Election protection helps voters 365 days a year, including through its multilingual bank of hotlines, including the 1-866-OUR-VOTE hotline. Voters and other interested people can call for information about elections and solving problems relating to their ability to vote in elections. We've been answering calls from voters already this year in connection with the primary elections. As you know, many of those elections have been detrimentally impacted by the COVID pandemic, and we've been helping voters throughout the year through the hotline. In addition to the hotline, we help organizations and voters in the states when issues arise that need problem solving, including when there's adverse legislation that is passed that impacts voters, and when other incidents occur throughout the year. And we do that both through advocacy and through our litigation efforts as well. Election protection has field programs in approximately 30 states now, where we have both legal trained volunteers as well as grassroots and other volunteers who help voters, as I said, 365 days a year, but particularly during election periods. And in traditional election protection years, we have had volunteers on the ground at polling places to assist voters outside the polling place if they're having trouble or have questions about exercising their right to vote. As a result of the COVID pandemic, we still have a field program in our states. However, we've had to pivot to having sort of a remote or a mobile polling monitoring setup where we have poll monitors and vehicles going around from polling places to polling places so they don't have exposure to COVID in front of the polling places themselves. So we have people there on the ground to help. We have the hotline up, and typically the hotline will take calls from voters, and when the need arises, we sometimes escalate those calls to volunteers on the grounds in the state where they can intercede with election officials to solve those problems.
Steve Milliken, our HR 73 classmate, who is also founder and CEO of Justice Aid. Steve?
Thank you, ClassACT, and mostly thank you, ClassACT, for introducing Therese Steiner to Justice Aid, because she's been immensely important to everything we do. Justice Aid is an organization started 7 years ago which uses the arts to raise money for civil rights organizations. And we have focused intensely over the past half a dozen years on mass incarceration, racist mass incarceration in particular. This year, all of us on the board, and this 18 months ago, determined that for 2020, the paramount civil right was the right to vote. And that's why we have devoted the entire year to supporting Election Protection 866-OUR-VOTE, which is a campaign of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. The Lawyers Committee, as you know, was formed by John Fitzgerald Kennedy's request back in 1963 to get lawyers from the private bar to take civil rights causes into the courts. And election protection is the largest coalition of nonpartisan voting rights advocacy and on-the-ground work to ensure free and fair elections. And that's why we chose them. And of course, the selection of this issue right now is completely aggravated by the novel coronavirus. COVID-19 is changing everything about how people are getting out to vote and making sure we do have free and fair elections. I'd like to spend a little time on partisanship because free and fair elections is a nonpartisan issue. It's a civil rights issue. Voter suppression is the partisan issue. Voter suppression, this is not a Republican or capital D Democratic issue. This is a democracy issue. So you can imagine if a leader says that we mustn't expand the right to vote by mail. I mean, consider that in the time of COVID-19. That is voter suppression. Consider how if somebody politically closes polling stations, as was done in Georgia in 2018, in majority Black districts, and as done quite recently, as you've heard, in Milwaukee in the recent Wisconsin primary. That's partisan voter suppression. Purging voter rolls is partisan voter suppression. Language barriers to absentee ballots is partisan voter suppression, as is unduly restrictive ID rules. The concern that this brings foremost to my mind is what happens to people who are disenfranchised over generations. They get utterly disaffected. And so it's fairly common for you to hear, why vote? My vote doesn't matter. And when someone says to you, my vote doesn't matter, please engage them in conversation and ask them, if your vote doesn't matter, why are they working so damn hard to suppress it?
We've asked panelists to share what they feel is the #1 issue facing our upcoming elections. And we're going to start with our HR 73 classmate, Helen Hershkoff. Helen is the Herbert M. and Svetlana Wachtel Professor of Constitutional Law and Civil Liberties at NYU Law School, where she's been teaching since 1995, and also the co-director of the Arthur Garfield Hayes Civil Liberties Program. We want to give a big shout out to Helen because not only did she secure our panelists, Kevin and Myrna, but also she requested that the chapter on voting rights from the book Getting By, Economic Rights and Legal Protections for People with Low Income that she co-authored with Stephen Lafredo, a professor of law at the City University of New York, who is also Helen's husband. Helen?
Thank you for that warm introduction. Let me give a shout out to Marion and Therese and Bachman and others from our class who have organized ClassACT, because as they put it, it's never too late to make the world a better place. I'm here tonight not as a voting rights expert, but as a concerned citizen and as a Harvard graduate. Like many of you, I've had a fortunate life. Other people, less fortunate than we, feel the brunt of voter suppression. But the problem is ours. My #1 issue tonight at this event is to encourage you, all of you, to step away from the sidelines. I believe that each of us, every one of us here tonight, needs to step up in ways large and small if we are to have fair elections for all Americans and help to save our democracy. As a model and as an inspiration, consider our wonderful classmate, Steve Milliken. You've heard how Justice Aid, the organization that Steve established after being a lawyer and a judge, uses money and music to help fund nonprofit groups that are trying to halt mounting inequality, increasing racism, and rising economic concentration, all of which threaten democracy and fair elections. Their work and Steve's contribution to it is large and important. But make no mistake, Steve also works in small and less visible ways. He'd be the last to tell you, but Steve wrote a check, a personal check, that allowed me and my author husband, Stephen Lofredo, to distribute 300 copies of our book, Getting By, to lawyers in New York City, in Michigan, and in Louisiana. Some of these lawyers have Harvard degrees, some of them have NYU degrees. All of them are underpaid, underappreciated, and overworked as they advocate for people who are less fortunate than we. Hundreds of thousands of people in the United States who, through no fault of their own, can't pay the rent and don't know where the next meal is coming from and are blocked at the polls when they try to cast their vote. So if you are here tonight, I assume that, like me, you are a concerned citizen. My number one issue is that you turn that concern into action. Working together in ways large and small, we can try to have fair elections. We can try to save our democracy.
For me, the number one issue really is the federal judiciary. I think that this matters in terms of, civil rights broadly and our constitutional rights, but even more specifically, we need the judiciary and we need a president who's going to appoint strong, independent leaders on the judiciary to protect voting rights. And we've seen how more conservatives and recent appointees on the court have treated the issue of voting rights when it comes to them trying to exercise those rights and gain access to the ballot in court, and they have not been favorable. So I think we all need to turn out to vote, and we need to get our friends mobilized to turn out to vote so we can have leaders in the political branches in place to guarantee that we have the right judges put on the judiciary to protect voting rights and our civil liberties more broadly.
I have a major worry that we are not going to be making the changes that we need to make quickly enough for voters to be able to benefit from them. And as such, I think a big thing that is critical is that we get federal funding immediately in the hands of state and local election administrators. They have a big job to do. They are under-resourced in the best of circumstances. And the kinds of pressures that are going to be placed upon them because of the adaptations and the changes that need to be made in order to make the election secure in the face of the coronavirus are going to be large. And as such, we need to get federal funding to them very, very quickly.
So how much would you estimate is needed?
A lot of people are suggesting that $4 billion needs to be in the stimulus package in order to be able to meet most of the needs that we have across the country. I think the truth of the matter is that elections are underfunded even in the best of circumstances, and we can always do more public education. But I think the amount of money that has been allocated by the federal government so far has been woefully inadequate. And $4 billion will make a big difference in a very good way.
This year's elections obviously are dramatically impacted by the COVID pandemic. As we've seen in past elections, including in Florida, which was really one of the first states affected by the COVID pandemic in a significant way during the primary election there. And then later on in Wisconsin, as many people saw through news reports and those on the ground in Wisconsin saw the horrible lines that resulted from the state's negative protocol about that election, where many people had to vote in person because they either didn't receive absentee ballots on time or they didn't qualify to get an absentee ballot. But what we've seen so far throughout the course of the elections held during the pandemic is that poll workers do not serve as they previously had. A lot of them are pulling out from serving as poll workers because of concerns about their own safety. That's resulted in a closure of large numbers of polling places in the states where they don't have the staff to open those polling places or conduct the elections there. Voters and election officials have had to do a lot of last-minute pivoting to have voters go to different locations than they normally would have gone to vote in person. And also voters are having to learn more about the vote by mail or absentee voting opportunities in their states where normally they might have typically voted in person. They're having to get a lot of new knowledge about how the state's vote by mail systems work, where states have those systems available. And it's taken some education on the part of election protection and our volunteers to bring voters up to speed on those issues in the states, and also voters having to get accustomed to voting under these unfortunate circumstances.
Yeah, you know, you've heard from the experts. I'm no expert. My really firm belief is that the single greatest thing that I can do is encourage people to give money to the experts so they can ensure free and fair elections, so they can fight voter suppression, so they can turn out votes, so that every eligible person has the opportunity to have their vote cast and count. And that takes money. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, change doesn't roll in on the wheels of inevitability, but comes through continuous struggle. Continuous civil rights struggles are costly. And, you know, we speak with people who say, I want to help, but I don't know how. The greatest single thing people can do is to raise money for social justice and civil rights organizations. And this year, the greatest single thing people can do is get out their checkbooks, open their wallets to give money to organizations that will ensure free and fair elections.
Let's start at the beginning of the process, which is voter registration. And several panelists have talked about voter registration. We have our traditional outlets of door-to-door canvassing not open because of COVID-19. We have churches not open. We have students who are on campus who can't mobilize. We have voter registration and voter ID laws that have changed in different states. What do we need to do to make sure that everyone has the right to register and does register?
That's a great question. And these are very good questions that I think hopefully we remember these questions not just, you know, in the context of this pandemic, but these are the things we're thinking about in every election because these are incredibly important, especially now. I think the thing that we should all do first and foremost is make sure we ourselves are registered to vote and we have requested absentee ballots, because we don't know what the situation is going to look like in October and November. So the first thing we should do is make sure we ourselves will get to access our right to vote. The second thing we should do is, you know, as you pointed out, you know, churches, churches, political organizations, the normal ways in which we do get out the vote strategies, those aren't available to us. So the second thing I would recommend we do is reach out to the people we do know and we do have good relationships with, and use those person-to-person contacts to make sure our friends and family members are both registered to vote and that they can vote and that they have requested that absentee ballot. And if they don't, that they have a plan to do so. We should be asking them for more than just a commitment. We should be finding out when they're planning to request that absentee ballot, and once they've had it, when they're going to send it in. I think that making sure everyone we know has a plan is a great step forward. In terms of making sure everyone's able to get access to, you know, the identification and the requirements they need to vote, I think the other thing we can do is just, you know, pressure our local elected officials. And if officials at one level are not being responsive, of course we should vote them out of office. But we should also, in the meantime, be reaching out to other officials at different levels of the government. I think that very local elected officials, for instance, officials at the city and county level, aren't often contacted by their constituents. And so even just a few people reaching out to them and asking for help can prompt them to be very responsive, and they might do whatever they can, even if it's more limited than people at the, you know, statewide or federal level.
That question is pregnant with a lot of different nuance. And I think the answer that I would have now when we're facing the coronavirus is a little bit different than what I would be facing under an ordinary election. If we were facing an ordinary election, I would say, you know, make sure you sign up with a group that goes out and registers voters. Make sure you know where you hit high traffic areas. Make sure that you're friendly and can articulate why it is that someone should register to vote. In this instance, this is going to depend upon a lot more like person-to-person contact through channels like media or over the phone. People need to be willing to help their neighbors walk through the process, which requires a great deal of patience and a good familiarity with the program. You know, just like you may have had to walk a colleague through how to use Zoom. during this crisis, you need to be prepared to be able to tell people this is a step that you must take in order to be able to get an application to vote, or in order to be able to register to vote, or how to get an application to register to vote. You may either need to walk them through how to do this online or how to get a paper copy and then talk them through it.
Some of the avenues that groups that traditionally do voter registration are pursuing now with the COVID pandemic is to find new ways to reach out to voters or prospective voters to make sure they register to vote through Zoom meetings or Skype meetings, which is a new platform for many of us, including voter registration groups on the ground. Still trying to communicate to voters via mail, sending mailings to them directly to encourage them to register to vote, and through public service announcements. And unfortunately, many states do not have a robust register on the same day of voting as some states do, which helps people who have either been purged from the rolls or haven't registered in time in advance of an election. But there's other ways people can register to vote through online voter registration in many states, or through traditional mail applications as well. And some states take voter registration applications via email or fax to make it easier in some locations for some voters to register to vote. But I know that a lot of the groups that are devoting a large amount of their time generally to voter registration are having to pivot and find new ways to engage with prospective voters to encourage them to register to vote and to help them.
Because of COVID-19, I understand Stacey Abrams was saying if you had 100 people who were going to vote and you could get 75 of them to get an absentee ballot and vote by mail in whatever form is available to them in the jurisdiction in which they reside, then that would greatly reduce the pressure on the polls, which will be understaffed, as we saw in Wisconsin recently. And then you get another group of those people to find, I don't know whether some places will allow vote by mail, then in addition, you can have absentee ballots, and ultimately you can reduce the pressure on the polling places and reduce the time and the pressure and the lines and the staffing and all the things that lead people not to be able to vote.
In the midst of a pandemic where there are physical distancing requirements, in order to keep everybody safe, we need to lean on a vote by mail process. We need to make it work for everybody, which means relying on the lessons learned from states that use it primarily. We do have a couple of states, or a few states in this country that almost entirely vote by mail. And they didn't get there overnight. They got there over years of practice, and they're refining their election processes. But we don't have to start from scratch either. We can take what states already do and look at what states that do, states that have been doing it for a long time, and figure out what lessons are applicable. And some of those things include making sure that everybody understands the relevant deadlines, making sure that there's not more hoops than you need to file over it, making sure that there are fail-safes in case things go wrong, making sure that the voter registration lists are already clean and accurate, up to date, make sure that you have good ballot counting procedures, and making sure that you have security measures in place so that nobody can scream fraud afterwards.
Vote by mail does exist in a fair amount of the states now. Unfortunately, the rules pertaining to vote by mail vary widely depending upon the state. Some states, such as Georgia, require voters to apply for an absentee ballot, and then when they submit the absentee ballot, there's a signature match requirement where the state examines whether the signature on the ballot envelope matches the voter's signature that's on file with the Secretary of State's office. And in many cases, people have registered to vote many, many years before an election. So it's unlikely that their signature is going to exactly match the card that they submitted when they registered to vote. So if that occurs now in this COVID pandemic era, voters have to submit an affidavit in writing, as well as identification documents to prove that they were actually the person that submitted that vote by mail ballot. And we're concerned that people will have trouble submitting those forms if they don't have access to the internet, for example, or a computer or a printer at home, or don't have the ability to submit those materials to their election office via email or fax. So that's something we're trying to address with our coalition members on the ground to try and help voters who face problems submitting those documents to be able to vote absentee. And we've seen in other states too that some states like Florida do have more generous opportunities for voting by mail, including on election day, where a voter, if they can't get to the polls because of the COVID pandemic, can enlist a relative to obtain the ballot from the election office on election day, bring it to the voter, have the voter choose their candidates on the ballot and give the ballot back to their relative to deliver to the election officials. And that's a handy option for people in Florida who were affected by the COVID pandemic. However, other states have deadlines where you have to submit the ballot in advance of the election or have it postmarked by election day and don't offer those opportunities to collect and pick up the ballot and bring it back on election day. So we're encouraging folks to really look at what the available options are in the state and make a plan for voting given the current COVID situation, to make sure that they know what the deadlines are, know what they need to do to submit a vote by mail ballot if that's available in their states, and what they need to watch out for in the event there's a signature match requirement similar to what they have in Georgia, and find out that their signature doesn't match and what they need to do to cure that mismatch. One of the other issues to be concerned about with vote by mail, although vote by mail is a great help to many, many voters across the country, is that it doesn't help everyone. For example, voters with disabilities who are unable to write on a ballot, hand-marked ballot, have to vote on machines often in order to be able to exercise their right to vote, including in privacy, where they don't have to rely on a family member or neighbor or friend to help them fill out a handwritten ballot. In addition, there are many people in the country who are housing insecure, who don't have a home address, where they can't receive an absentee ballot by mail. And in many jurisdictions, you have to receive the ballot by mail. So those individuals have to often rely on voting in person in order to cast a ballot. So when you're talking about vote by mail, there has to be a consideration for people who cannot vote by mail for those reasons, so that there are opportunities for them to participate in the election.
So it depends by state. Some states, for instance, Washington state already does almost all of its elections, really most of them, by vote by mail already. So this does vary, but oftentimes, and I would expect in almost all cases, if a state does not do vote by mail already, it would require a legislative change. So it would require coordination and collaboration between both the governors in each state and their respective legislatures. Unfortunately, this is where it's going to be a problem for swing states like my home state of Wisconsin, and that many of the swing states in the Midwest and elsewhere have split legislatures and governors, so they're not represented by the same party. And so we do risk running into situations where certain politicians seeking to take advantage of the pandemic may attempt to, prevent vote by mail. And that's all the more reason why we should be planning now and planning ahead in case there's not a universal mandate for vote by mail.
Kevin, you brought up very powerfully that your key issue relates to the future of the judiciary. Could you share a little bit about why that's so important in America right now?
Great, thanks. I would say that the judiciary is important to me and really to all of us, because when it comes to our constitutional rights and increasing civil liberties, it will take more than just a president and a Congress committed to those issues, that's passing laws to protect those sorts of values. It's going to take a court to enforce them. And we've seen this in the past, for instance, with voting rights. There is a Federal Voting Rights Act. For many decades, it actually created huge inroads for disenfranchised communities to have their voices heard. Unfortunately, over the past 2 decades, we have seen the Voting Rights Act be cabined, not by a legislature and not by the president, but by certain judges who are reading the purpose of that statute into oblivion. And again, this is because of the judges and the power that they have, as a separate branch. So it's incredibly important that we have, judges appointed who are going to really read the values of the Constitution back into our everyday lives. And to do so, that requires electing, different people to Congress and, having a different president, to be quite frank.
Steve, you are a judge, a former federal judge. What's going on and what can we do to protect it?
I think the most frightening thing is the politicization of the judiciary. Let me start over. I think the most frightening thing is the politicization of the judiciary. To have had in Bush v. Gore what the American people felt was a partisan decision from the Supreme Court in a matter that had always been reserved to state prerogative was utterly dismaying. And I think people look at judicial appointments as being carved up in a partisan way that absolutely corrupts the independence of the judiciary. One of the greatest rocks on which this democracy is founded is the independence of the judiciary. And we saw it again in a different form, but with the recent Supreme Court decision to say that the putting voters at risk of COVID-19 as against the choice to vote in Wisconsin was something that the Supreme Court, again in a partisan split based on recent appointments, was going to allow to happen. That's twice. And I think it deeply threatens one cornerstone in our tripartite system of government.
Several panelists referred to voter apathy in this upcoming election, and a recent study by the Knight Foundation with 14,000 people participating found that 29% of non-voters didn't vote because they weren't interested. They weren't interested. And 28% didn't vote because they felt that their vote doesn't matter. You combine this with the fact that 31% of millennials don't feel it's important to live in a democracy. What can we be doing about this?
Well, I think first by eliminating some of these barriers to the ballot box where people become so frustrated with the system that they feel that their vote doesn't count because it's either not going to be counted because they didn't cross every T and dot every I, or for other reasons, of discrimination towards certain groups in the election process. And so once you start eliminating those barriers and make it easier for people to vote and cast their ballots, that will help, I believe, encourage people to know that their vote will be counted and that they can participate in democracy. And I think there's a key element of civic education that may be missing these days where people are not receiving civic education about the importance of voting and what it means to be able to elect candidates who will watch out for you and make sure that your rights are looked after when you elect certain candidates to certain positions in government.
It makes me so sad and frustrated to hear people think that their vote doesn't matter. That's wrong. The vote is a little piece of nonviolence. It is the way we resolve our political differences. It is the way we set the direction of the country. And I can't sit and pretend that voting is going to change all of the ills of our country, but I can tell you it's not going to get better if you don't vote. Voting is the way we come together as a country, and it doesn't matter if you are rich or poor or black or white or educated or not educated. Once you step into the ballot box, your vote counts the same as everybody else's. And that is a power and a strength and an equalizing force that nobody should take for granted.
It's a perennial problem. It comes up in every election, but I think it's incredibly important to think about that problem now in the midst of, coronavirus, since people are feeling disillusioned about a lot of things and feeling helpless about a lot of things. And the election may not be the thing that is first and foremost on their mind. So we absolutely need to be thinking about that now, in addition to contacting all of our elected officials and voting ourselves. And the thing I would think that we can do is, reach out to the people we know and have relationships with, our friends from, our friends from Harvard, our friends from work, our friends, throughout life, and our family members. There are also various organizations that you can get engaged with to do voter outreach remotely from the safety of your home. You can absolutely do that, and I think that's fantastic and is always a great idea. But I really think that the best thing we can all do, that is maybe the easiest thing, is to talk to the people we know, the people with whom we're close to, and make sure that they're going to get out to vote. Because if we all do that, and that, if all of the people we know vote, and they make sure the people they know vote, we're going to see voting rights and, democracy really in action in a way we hadn't seen before.
Well, I can't remember who said that democracy is a terrible form of government. It's just better than all the rest of them. And the idea that we would willingly succumb to tyranny is madness. You'll have to remind me who it was who said that you'll have a democracy for as long as you can keep it. Maybe it was de Tocqueville, or maybe it was Ben Franklin. But for a very, very long time, it's been recognized that democracy is messy and very hard to maintain. But the alternative is tyranny.
The clock is ticking. We just have a few more months until the November election. So what I'd like is for each panelist to let us know, what is the one call to action that you would like each of us to know about so that everyone can make a difference?
You have to call every representative you have in Congress and tell them that they must allocate federal funds for elections to make sure that every eligible American will be able to cast a ballot safely in November, and that our right to vote does not have to butt against our right to be safe and healthy.
My key call to action as the Managing Counsel for Election Protection at the Lawyers Committee is to ask that people volunteer, if not for election protection, which I hope they do, since we recruit both legal volunteers and grassroots and other volunteers, and there's plenty of opportunities to volunteer for election protection. There's other ways to help the election process in your states and in your local jurisdictions, including volunteering to be poll workers, including volunteering to monitor election meetings by boards of elections to see what's happening on the ground and to advocate for better elections and better administration of elections. So there's many opportunities that people have who have an interest in improving elections to volunteer, either with groups that do voter registration or election protection, or with the election office in your locality, and to monitor what's happening both in the local jurisdictions as well as in the state legislatures to make voting better for everyone.
My number one call to action for this election would be make sure that you yourself have requested an absentee ballot so you can vote by mail, and make sure that everyone else you know has done the same.
My call to action is simple. Go to justiceaid.org, find the donate button, hit it, give what you're able, knowing that dollar for dollar of what you donate will go to Election Protection 866-R-VOTE, the campaign of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. And every dollar that you give will be matched up to $100,000 by the Board of Justice Aid. So we hope to raise $200,000 for election protection this spring. Justice Aid uses the arts to raise money for civil rights organizations. And we had lined up for election protection, a concert May 18th at City Winery, following a forum at Riverside Church, and in the fall, concerts featuring Mavis Staples at the Lincoln Theater, along with a Civic Life Project film festival to bring young people's voices to issues that matter to young people in a format that will encourage young people to vote, particularly young people of color who are particularly disenfranchised. We are turning all that material into virtual content and will endeavor to broadcast it. Please sign on to justiceaid.org, not only to donate so we can support election protection, but to stay tuned to coming attractions where you will find the artists and other information about the events we're producing.
My number one call to action, what I'm hearing tonight is that to get out the vote, we need to get out the truth. Of course, elections are about winning. But elections also are about fairness, about integrity, and about equality. Elections are about the future we want for our children and for their children, and the future we should want for all of America's children. Let's use our resources, and for some of us, yes, let's use the power and privilege of a Harvard education to get the truth out. The truth about the need for mail-in ballots, about the unfairness, irrationality, and racism of many ID laws, and about the partisan cruelty of making people, mostly people of color, choose between exercising the franchise and risking exposure to COVID-19. To get the vote out, people of integrity with resources and power and privilege, the kinds of power and privilege present in this room tonight, need to get out the truth. Do this in any way you can, by writing op-eds, by sending letters to the editor, by engaging with social media, and by talking with people who might not be your friends. And maybe, just maybe, we'll be able to save our democracy. The stakes have never been higher.
Thank you, panelists, for an incredible and illuminating conversation. I'd like to close with a quote from Shirley Chisholm. Shirley Chisholm was the first African-American woman elected to Congress, where she served the great state of New York for 7 terms. She also was a self-described catalyst for change. And this is what she said: "The one thing you've got going is your vote."
I vote for change. I vote for progress. I believe history is cyclical, but I believe we can move it forward like an unfolding spring. And I vote for change, for progress, for people.
My parents are Mexican immigrants, and my mother spent a lot of her life not being registered to vote. And I remember being intoxicated by the idea of being able to make a difference in my country. I love voting. I love the idea that it is a tangible symbol that I care about my country, I care about my community. I am able to bind myself with other Americans to be able to set the direction. And I love that the way we as a country make decisions is by having our votes get bundled together and used to elect leaders who are responsible for things that are really important to us, ranging from the quality of the air we breathe to what kinds of schools our kids go to how clean the water is that we put into our body. The vote is my voice, and I use it as often as I can, and I think other people should too.
It's participation in our basic democratic principles. I vote because I want to have a better community. I want to have a better America for myself, my family, my child, and my child's future. And I think that that's the core reasons why people should be voting, is to make sure that we have a better government for everyone.
I vote because it is the only way to make sure that people who grew up like me have a chance to have a better life. No one in my family ever went to college so much as law school, so much as went to go on to teach at a law school. I grew up on a dairy farm on food stamps. The idea of like getting an education beyond high school was just not something people in my family thought about. But because at the time, elected officials in Wisconsin really valued education, and they really valued investing in, giving people a chance. I had the opportunity to get a scholarship to go to the University of Wisconsin and really go farther than anyone else in my family did. And if it weren't for elected officials and, people being in office that cared about those sort of things, making sure that the least privileged among us have a chance to advance themselves and show their merit, I would not be where I am today. And so I vote to hopefully make sure that people who were like me, farm kids like me in Wisconsin, who want to go farther, have the opportunity to do so.
Why do I vote? Many of you in this audience will remember a slogan from college that the personal is political. My life is proof positive of that statement. I'm a first-generation American. My father was born in Poland. My family benefited from sound social policy. My dad attended City College, and he took some courses on the GI Bill. I attended public school in Brooklyn, way before Brooklyn was cool, and became the first woman in my family to attend college. And now I'm living a life that my parents could imagine only in their dreams. I vote because politics should not just be personal. Politics should support the dreams of all citizens and all those who aspire to be citizens, and not just a privileged few. I hope you agree.
That was fantastic. Thank you to our panelists, Steve Milliken of Justice Aid, Julie Houk of Election Protection, Myrna Pérez of the Brennan Center for Justice, Kevin Benish, lawyer and Wisconsin activist, Helen Hershkoff, classmate and NYU law professor, and our moderator, Therese Steiner. And thank you to all of you who have joined us as listeners this evening. I encourage you all to be activists. If you have not done so already, please go to the ClassACT Voter and Civic Engagement webpage and fill out the Voter and Civic Engagement survey. Shortly, we will send you a follow-up document via email with our ClassACT Forum Voter Suppression and Voter Rights call to action, as well as links to the actions recommended by our panelists. Be safe, be well, take action, and good night.